At 18, Bryn Holt thought the worst thing buried at Fallow Ridge was debt. Then, behind her Uncle Silas's barn, a rusted gate came free and exposed a clean edge of red sandstone. She brushed away the clay. One step became three. Three became 12. The staircase ended at a solid stone wall except for a narrow gap at the bottom, where cold air moved against her hand. That night, before Bryn could learn what was hidden beneath the farm, another surprise arrived. Dale Holt's attorney had formally challenged Silas's will. The land Bryn had just inherited might not remain hers. By Sunday morning, the wall was down. Beyond it waited an intact stone, chamber shelves, iron hooks, ventilation pipes, and a drainage channel built to keep the room cold and dry. Then Bryn found 4 sets of initials carved beneath a lower shelf. The last 2 were BH, the same initials as her own. They had been cut into that stone more than a century before she was born. Silas had spent 15 years refusing offers for this ground. So what exactly had he been protecting? And why had he left Bryn to discover it only after his death? Bryn Holt woke before the alarm most mornings now, not because she wanted to, but because the farm did not care whether an 18-year-old girl felt ready for it. Fallow Ridge Farm sat on 210 acres of Pennsylvania hill country, the kind of land that looked gentle in photographs and felt like a debt in person. 6 months earlier, it had belonged to her uncle Silas Holt, and before that, it had belonged to nobody who was still alive to explain how it worked. Now it belonged to her, along with the loan against it, the leaking roof on the equipment shed, and a field called Lower Fallow that had started behaving like a swamp every time it rained. She made coffee in a kitchen that still had Silas's reading glasses folded on the windowsill because she had not found the nerve to move them. The bank statement sat under a magnet on the refrigerator, the numbers on it unchanged from the night before, since numbers did not improve simply because a person stared at them long enough. The operating loan Silas had taken out 2 winters ago to replace a tractor was still owed in full. The payment was due at the end of the season, tied to a harvest that depended on ground that currently held water like a bathtub with the drains stopped up. Outside, past the kitchen window, the farm went on being a farm regardless of who was worried about it. The cows still needed moving to the back pasture before the morning got too warm. The fence along the east line still had a sagging section she had been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. Grief, she was learning, did not pause a schedule that animals and weather did not know how to read. And there was a kind of mercy in that, even on mornings when she would have welcomed the excuse to simply sit still. She was 18 years old. She had graduated high school in June, buried her uncle in July, and by August, she had learned more about drainage tile, feed contracts, and interest rates than most people learn in a lifetime of not needing to know them. Silas had raised her since she was 6. After her parents died in a car accident on Route 9 during an ice storm neither of them saw coming. He had never adopted her formally. He had simply kept her, the way a person keeps something they consider theirs to protect. And when he died of a heart attack in the hay barn on an ordinary Tuesday, the will he left named her as his sole heir without a single line of explanation for why. She had assumed in the numb weeks after the funeral that this was the end of the surprises. She was wrong about that, though she did not know it yet. The bank had called the previous week a loan officer named Roger Delling, who had known Silas for 2 decades and spoke to Bryn now with the careful courtesy of a man who genuinely liked her uncle and did not yet know what to make of the girl who had inherited his debts. He told her the operating loan payment was still on schedule for the end of the season, that the bank had no interest in being difficult about it given the circumstances, but that the payment itself had not changed and would not change regardless of how the harvest turned out. He asked her, not unkindly, whether she had a plan in place if Lower Fallow continued underperforming the way it had the previous 2 years. She told him she did not have a full plan yet, only a drainage consultant scheduled to come look at the field the following week, and he told her that was a reasonable first step and that he hoped for her sake it turned up something fixable. He did not say what would happen if it did not. He did not have to. She had already done the math herself more than once, sitting at the kitchen table with Silas's old ledger open in front of her, and the number that came back every time was not one she could afford to be wrong about twice. The knock at the door came on a Thursday morning while she was still deciding whether the coffee was enough to justify calling it breakfast. She opened it to a man in his 40s, wearing a jacket too clean for farm country, standing beside a rental car parked crooked in the gravel. He said his name was Dale Holt. Bryn had never heard the name in her life, and yet the shape of the man's jaw and the particular way he tilted his head while he waited for a reaction told her, before he said another word, that whatever came next was going to be a problem. He explained it plainly enough. He was Silas's son, born before Silas ever came back to Fallow Ridge to run the family land, the product of a marriage that had ended badly and quietly decades earlier. He had grown up 2 states away with his mother, had spoken to his father perhaps a dozen times as an adult, and had learned of Silas's death from an obituary a cousin forwarded him 3 weeks after the funeral. He had not been invited. He had not been told. And now he stood on the porch of a farm he said was rightfully half his, looking at an 18-year-old girl he had never met, informed that the entire estate had gone to her and to her alone. Bryn did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway with one hand still on the frame and told him she had never heard his name mentioned once in 12 years, which was true and which did nothing to soften his expression. He told her that a will written by a man who never disclosed his own son's existence to his heir was not going to survive a challenge in court, and that she should expect to hear from his attorney within the week. She asked him before he turned to leave why now. If he was truly Silas's son, if the blood between them was real and not simply a claim made from 2 states away, why had he waited until the funeral was over and the ground was settled before knocking on a door he had apparently never once knocked on while his father was alive? He told her that was not a question she had any right to ask him, standing on a porch that belonged, in his view, to him as much as it belonged to her. He said he had tried, once years ago, to reconnect with his father, and had been turned away in a manner he was not prepared to discuss with a stranger, however much that stranger currently occupied his father's house. He said whatever bitterness existed between him and Silas was old business, settled or unsettled on its own terms, and none of it changed what the law said about a son's claim against an estate that failed to acknowledge him. Bryn told him that Silas had never once, in 12 years, spoken his name, not in anger and not in memory, and that whatever had happened between the two of them, her uncle had clearly considered it closed long before she was old enough to ask about it. Dale's jaw tightened at that in a way that told her the words had landed somewhere real, though he did not let it show for long. He told her again that he would be in touch through his attorney, and that she should not mistake his patience this morning for any kind of concession. Then he got back in his rental car and left her standing in the doorway with cold coffee in her hand and a version of her uncle she had never been given the chance to ask about. She called Corinne Ashby that same afternoon. Corinne had been Silas's lawyer for 11 years, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an office above the hardware store in town that smelled permanently of paper and coffee. Bryn had met her exactly twice before, both times to sign documents she had barely understood at the time. Now she sat across the same scarred wooden desk and explained what had happened on her porch that morning, her voice steadier than she felt. Corinne listened without interrupting, then took off her glasses and set them down carefully. She told Bryn that Silas had never once mentioned a son to her either, not in 11 years of estate planning conversations, which was unusual but not impossible, and that a challenge from an undisclosed heir was a real legal threat, but not an automatic one. Wills held up in Pennsylvania more often than people assumed. Dale would need to prove either that the will was invalid on its face, or that Silas lacked capacity, or was subject to undue influence when he wrote it. And none of those were easy things to establish against a document that was properly signed, witnessed, and notarized years before Silas died. She told Bryn, plainly, that this did not mean it would be simple, or quick, or free of cost, and that the best thing Bryn could do in the meantime was keep running the farm exactly as she had been, keep every record clean, and not make any large decisions about the property that could later be painted as suspicious. Bryn asked her what large decisions meant. Corinne said selling anything, borrowing against anything, or making sudden changes to the land itself. Anything that looked like someone in a hurry to do something, before a court could weigh in. She added, watching Bryn carefully, that she understood how frightening a threat like this could feel to someone Bryn's age, alone in a house that had belonged to someone else only months earlier. But that fear was not the same as danger, and that from what Corinne had seen so far, Dale's case rested on very little beyond the fact that he existed and had not been mentioned. That was not nothing, legally speaking, but it was a long way from the kind of evidence that actually overturned a properly executed will. Before she left, Corinne asked her one more question, quieter than the rest. She asked whether Bryn had ever heard Silas mention a son, even once, in passing, in an old photograph, in an offhand comment about a life he lived before he came back to run the farm. Bryn told her no. Not once, not in 12 years, not even the vague kind of mention a person might let slip without meaning to. Silas had talked about his own father sometimes, about the farm before her time, about the winter he lost half the herd to a blizzard the year before she was born, but never once about a wife, a marriage, or a child born somewhere else and left behind. Corinne told her that absence was not proof of anything on its own, since plenty of men carried entire chapters of their lives quietly and never spoke of them again, but that it was worth remembering regardless. Because a man capable of protecting a secret that completely, for over a decade, was also a man capable of protecting other things just as completely, for reasons he never felt the need to explain to anyone standing in front of him. Bryn thanked her, drove home with both hands tight on the wheel, and did not mention any of it to Hank Osgood when she passed him in the barnyard that evening. Mostly because she did not yet know how to say it out loud without her voice breaking somewhere in the middle. Hank had worked for Silas for 19 years, long enough to remember Bryn as a 6-year-old following her uncle around the equipment shed, asking why everything was broken all the time. He was somewhere past 60 now, built like a man who had spent his whole life lifting things that did not want to be lifted, and he had quietly become the only steady thing left in Bryn's daily life since the funeral. He did not ask about the man in the rental car. He simply told her, over the sound of the diesel engine cooling in the dusk, that Lower Fallow was worse again. Standing water in the northeast corner, deep enough to leave a ring around a fence post that had been dry a month earlier. That was the problem Bryn actually had time to think about, because it was the one with a deadline attached to it that a lawyer could not argue away. She had a consultant scheduled to come look at the drainage the following week, a methodical man from the county extension office who had already told her over the phone that the original field tile behind the barn was almost certainly the source of the trouble, and that whatever system had once carried water away from that side of the property was no longer doing its job. The consultant arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, a heavyset man named Elton Marsh, who worked out of the county extension office and had the unhurried manner of someone who had walked 1,000 fields exactly like this one. He spent 2 hours crossing Lower Fallow with a metal probe and a clipboard, kneeling occasionally to push the probe into the softened ground and frown at whatever resistance or lack of it he found there. He told her, standing at the fence line with mud past his boot soles, that the field had almost certainly been served once by a network of clay drain tile running down from higher ground near the barn, a common enough system on farms this age, and that from the pattern of standing water she was describing, at least one section of that tile had likely collapsed or silted shut entirely. He said he could not know for certain what he was dealing with until someone traced the line back to its origin, which, on a farm this old, usually meant finding wherever the original outlet or collection point had been built, often somewhere near the oldest structures on the property. Bryn asked him what that meant in practical terms. He told her plainly that unless the blockage was found and cleared, the field would only get worse, not better, and that another wet spring could put enough of Lower Fallow underwater to cost her a meaningful share of next year's yield on top of whatever she lost this year. He recommended she start by clearing whatever access she could to the ground directly behind the barn, since that was the most likely place the original drainage infrastructure would have been laid, given the slope of the land and the direction the water clearly wanted to travel. He asked her, almost as an afterthought, while packing his probe back into its case, whether the ground behind the barn had ever been surveyed for anything else, since old farms in this part of the state sometimes turned up more than broken drain tile when someone finally got around to clearing 40 years of accumulated neglect. He said it lightly, the way a man says something he does not expect to matter, and Bryn told him she had no idea, since nobody currently living on the farm had ever had reason to look. He laughed and told her that was usually how it went, and wished her luck with the digging. It was, in the end, a simple enough instruction, one line among many in a morning full of technical language about tile spacing and hydraulic gradient. But it was the line that sent her out behind the barn 3 days later with a telehandler and a pair of gloves too big for her hands, and it would turn out to be the only piece of that morning's conversation that actually mattered. To find it, she would need to clear the ground behind the barn, a stretch of land roughly 30 feet by 45 running along the back wall down toward the old line of hawthorn at the property boundary. Silas had never touched it in the 18 months before his death, and from what Bryn could tell, walking the edge of it with a flashlight that evening, nobody had touched it in a great deal longer than that. It was not visible from the road. It had never bothered anything simply by existing. It had become, over the course of decades, the place where every piece of equipment too broken to fix and too solid to burn had gone to wait for a day of reckoning that kept getting postponed, generation after generation, until the day arrived by accident because a field 100 yards away would not drain. She started clearing it on Saturday morning, alone, with the telehandler and a pair of leather gloves that had belonged to Silas and were still a size too big for her hands. The layers told their own story as she worked through them. Nearest the barn wall, buried under moss and compacted leaf litter, were the collapsed remains of what had once been wooden livestock hurdles, rotted down to a soft brown pulp that came apart in her hands. On top of those lay sheets of corrugated metal roofing, buckled and streaked with rust, the kind farmers used for decades to patch anything that needed patching and never got properly replaced. Beneath that came an old fuel drum with no lid, coils of barbed wire tangled with baler twine into something that looked less like scrap and more like a trap, the frame of a harrow with half its tines snapped clean off, and a wheel assembly from something she could not immediately identify, the hub cracked straight through. Deeper still, the character of the junk changed entirely. It grew heavier, cast iron instead of pressed steel, forged instead of welded, the kind of equipment that belonged to a farm that had not yet been connected to the county power grid. She found the rusted body of an old portable engine, the sort once used to run a water pump when there was no other way to move water uphill, and a set of iron weights that had clearly hung once from a scale beam long since gone. She worked steadily through the early afternoon, the telehandler groaning. Under loads of twisted metal she hauled to the scrap pile near the drive, the muscles in her forearms burning in a way that reminded her, not unpleasantly, that this was still fundamentally the same kind of labor she had been doing all summer, just with stranger objects passing through her hands, a rusted gate hinge, a cracked ceramic insulator from some long dismantled fence line, a child's metal wagon wheel with no wagon attached to it anywhere in the pile, which she set aside without quite knowing why, some instinct telling her it belonged to a story she was not yet equipped to guess at. Each object had been a decision, made by someone who was no longer alive to explain it. Deal with this later. Later had finally arrived, roughly 4 decades after it was first postponed, and it had arrived in the hands of a girl who was still learning how to read a bank statement without her stomach turning over. Near the middle of the pile, wedged beneath a collapsed section of fencing, she found a hand tool she recognized immediately, a fencing pliers with a worn wooden handle, and Silas's initials burned crudely into the wood with a hot nail. The same tool she remembered him carrying in his back pocket every day of her childhood until he replaced it with a newer model years later. She stood holding it for a moment longer than the discovery strictly required, turning it over once, then to set it aside on the tailgate of the truck rather than the scrap pile, telling herself it was simply a good tool worth keeping, and not entirely believing her own reasoning. By early afternoon, she had cleared close to 2/3 of the space. The ground beneath it was pale and strangely compressed, almost chalky, in places where nothing had grown in years for lack of light. She could see the ghost of a path running through it. Not a formal walkway, but a strip of earth worn down by regular footsteps, running roughly perpendicular to the barn wall, in a way that made no sense for a pile of forgotten junk. She noted it and kept working, because the light was already starting to lean sideways through the trees and she wanted to reach the hawthorn line before dark. She dragged clear a final section of rusted iron gate that had been leaning against a heap of broken concrete block, and when it came free, she saw something that made her stop entirely. A straight edge. Not the rounded curve of a broken slab, not the wandering line of a buried curb, but a deliberately cut edge of flat stone lying at an angle in the earth that had nothing to do with the mess around it. She crouched down and brushed the loose soil away with her bare hand. The stone underneath was dressed, not rough fieldstone thrown down for drainage, but shaped and fitted the way a person shapes something they intend to last. She cleared more of the dirt away, and another surface appeared beneath the first, and then another below that. They were steps. Stone steps descending into the ground behind her uncle's barn, 3 of them visible with the strong suggestion of more still buried beneath the compacted soil at the base of the pile. Each one was roughly 2 feet wide and 9 inches deep, cut from a warm reddish sandstone that she recognized from the older foundation stones of the farmhouse itself. The risers were clean. The treads tilted very slightly forward, built to shed water rather than collect it. Whoever had built this had not thrown it together in an afternoon. It had been planned. She stood there in the fading light, with dirt under her fingernails, and the question that formed in her mind was simple enough. Where were they meant to go? She fetched a spade and a stiff bristled broom from the barn and spent the next hour working carefully around and below the exposed steps, clearing the heavy clay soil away in chunks. At the third step down, the spade struck something that rang with a dull metallic note instead of the soft thud of stone. She brushed the earth back and found an iron fitting mortared directly into the sandstone, a socket roughly 2 inches across, set on the left side of the staircase, just above the third step, a handrail socket. The kind installed when a staircase was expected to be used regularly, in poor light, by people carrying things that needed both hands free. By the time the last of the daylight failed her, she had uncovered 12 steps in total, and the 12th met a solid built wall of the same stone. It was not a collapsed section of anything. It was intact, deliberate, clearly meant to be there, and yet the staircase kept descending toward it, and simply stopped, leaving a gap of perhaps 4 inches of open space between the bottom of the wall and whatever lay on the other side. Cold air moved steadily through that gap. She felt it against the back of her hand when she reached down to touch the stone. Not damp, not foul, just cold in the steady mineral way of earth that had never once been touched by direct sunlight. There was something behind that wall, and it had been there sealed and waiting for longer than anyone still living on this farm could account for. She went back inside, washed the clay off her hands at the kitchen sink, and sat at the table for a long time without turning on the overhead light, the phone in front of her, showing a missed call from a number she did not recognize, and a voicemail she did not yet have the stomach to play. She played it eventually. It was Dale's attorney, a clipped voice explaining that a formal petition to challenge the validity of Silas Holt's last will and testament had been filed that afternoon with the County Register of Wills, and that Bryn Holt, as named executor and sole beneficiary, would be receiving notice by mail within the next several business days. She set the phone down on the table and stared at the dark window over the sink for a long moment, feeling the ground shift under her for the second time in one day. Once beneath a pile of 40 years of scrap metal, and once beneath the entire shape of the life she had assumed was finally hers to run without interruption. She thought, briefly and uselessly, about calling Dale herself, about asking him plainly why a man who had never once tried to touch his father while he was alive was now in such a hurry to challenge him now that he was gone. She decided against it before she had even finished forming the thought, aware that anything she said to him directly could be repeated in a courtroom stripped of whatever context she meant it in. It was a strange, unfamiliar kind of caution, the sort that came from understanding for the first time that she was no longer simply a girl running a farm, but a named party in a legal matter whose every word might eventually matter to someone other than herself. She went to bed that night without eating dinner, the fencing pliers still sitting on the kitchen counter where she had set them down without quite deciding to, and lay awake longer than she wanted to, listening to the old house settle around her the way it always did after dark, and thinking less about Dale's attorney than about 12 stone steps sitting untouched behind the barn waiting, the way they had apparently been waiting for a very long time already. She called Corinne first thing the next morning. Corinne had already heard, since the filing was of public record, and word traveled fast in a county small enough that everyone at the Register of Wills office knew everyone else's business by lunchtime. Corinne told her the filing itself was not a surprise given the conversation on the porch, and that it did not change anything about the strength of the will, only the timeline. There would be a hearing date set, likely within a matter of weeks rather than months given how the local court calendar tended to run. And until then, Bryn's job was exactly what it had been the day before. Keep the farm running. Keep the records clean. Do not do anything that a hostile lawyer could later describe as reckless. Bryn asked her carefully whether finding something unexpected on the property counted as reckless. Corinne asked her what she meant. Bryn told her about the steps behind the barn, the sealed wall, the cold air moving through the gap at the bottom of it, though she left out the part where she had spent 20 minutes simply sitting on the 12th step in the dark, unwilling to leave until she had at least tried to understand what she was looking at. Corinne was quiet on the line for a moment, then told her that anything historical or structural on the property was worth documenting carefully before touching it further. Not because of Dale, but because it was simply the responsible thing to do on a piece of land that clearly had more history buried in it than anyone currently living had bothered to learn. She suggested Bryn take the question to the county archive before she did anything else with a hammer and a bolster chisel, both to protect herself legally and because it was possible, however unlikely, that whatever sat behind that wall carried some kind of historical designation that would matter later. Bryn agreed, mostly because it gave her something concrete to do with her hands and her attention that was not simply waiting for a court date to arrive in the mail. She drove into town the following morning, past the hardware store, where Corinne's office sat above the paint aisle, past the diner, where two farmers she recognized by their trucks were arguing quietly about soybean prices, and pulled up outside the county administration building, where the historical archive occupied a single coastal room on the second floor. The woman behind the counter introduced herself as Louise Bramwell, somewhere in her 50s, with the unhurried patience of someone who had spent a long career answering questions nobody else in the building had the time for. Bryn explained what she had found: the steps, the sealed wall, the cold air, and Louise's expression shifted from polite professional interest into something sharper and more attentive. She pulled out a set of flat drawers Bryn had not noticed at first, sliding out large folded survey maps that smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Together they worked through a series of documents: tithe maps from the mid-1800s, an early county survey from the 1880s, and a cluster of agricultural estate records covering the handful of farms that had once shared the same stretch of valley. Bryn's family still worked today. It was on the 1884 survey that Louise finally stopped, adjusting her glasses and leaning closer to the faded ink. There was a small notation at the exact location behind what would later become the Holt barn, cramped 19th century handwriting, that took her a moment to decipher fully. Common store, it read. Bryn asked what that meant. Louise explained that in that era, before mechanical refrigeration existed anywhere in rural Pennsylvania, a handful of neighboring farms would sometimes pool their labor and resources to build a single shared structure for preserving food through the warmer months, since no single family typically had the money or manpower to build something like that alone. A common store meant exactly what it sounded like: something built by more than one family, for the shared use of more than one family, at a time when survival through a hard winter or a hot summer often depended on exactly that kind of cooperation. She pulled a second document from a nearby folder, an old agricultural census summary from the same decade, and ran her finger down a column of handwritten entries, listing the farms along that stretch of valley by name. 4 properties clustered close enough together to make a shared structure practical, she explained, each too small on its own to justify the labor of building something so elaborate, but together representing enough hands and enough need to make it worth doing right. She said something like this was not unheard of in the historical record, but it was uncommon enough that she had personally seen only 2 other confirmed examples in the county in over 20 years of doing this work, and both of those had collapsed or been demolished decades ago, rather than surviving intact the way this one apparently had. Bryn asked her, cautiously, what became of arrangements like that once they were no longer needed. Louise told her it varied. Sometimes the structures were simply abandoned and left to the weather, since nobody wanted the liability of an open cellar behind a working barn. Sometimes families argued over who still had rights to use it, particularly if one family had contributed more labor or material than the others during construction. She said cooperation like that, built on trust between neighbors who could just as easily have been competitors for the same land and the same markets, tended to be fragile in exactly the way anything valuable and shared was fragile. It worked only as long as everyone involved kept honoring an agreement that existed mostly on trust rather than paper. Bryn sat with that information for a long moment, staring at the faded ink on a map that was already old before her own grandfather's grandfather had likely been born. Whatever waited behind the sealed wall on her property had not been built by one person hoarding something for themselves. It had been built by several families working together, generations before any of them could have known who might eventually stand on those same 12 steps wondering what they had left behind. She thanked Louise, photocopied the relevant pages, and drove home with the papers on the passenger seat, and a question in her mind considerably larger than the one she had arrived with that morning. Before she left the archive, Louise offered one more piece of advice, given the way Bryn's face had changed over the course of the afternoon. She told her that finds like this one, however exciting, had a way of attracting attention faster than a person expected, particularly in a county where everyone eventually heard about everything eventually, and suggested Bryn think carefully about who she told and when, at least until she understood better what she was actually sitting on. Bryn thanked her for the warning, though she would only understand within a matter of days exactly how right Louise had been to offer it. When she pulled into the farm's gravel drive, Hank was waiting by the barn door with his arms crossed, and the look on his face told her before he said a word that something else had happened while she was in town. He told her a man had come by asking questions, walking the property line near the Hawthorne boundary without permission, taking photographs of the cleared ground behind the barn with his phone before Hank had noticed him and asked him to leave. The man had given his name easily enough, almost too easily, as though he wanted it remembered. Wade Pruitt. He had left a business card wedged into the crack of the porch door, the kind of card printed on heavy stock, with a logo for a development company Bryn had never heard of, and a handwritten note on the back asking her to call him at her earliest convenience regarding a matter of, in his words, considerable mutual benefit. Bryn stood in the barnyard, holding the card between two fingers, the cold air from the vaults still fresh in her memory, the voicemail from Dale's attorney still sitting unanswered on her phone, and the photocopied county map still on the passenger seat of her truck, confirming that whatever she had found belonged to more than just her. She didn't know yet who Wade Pruitt was, or how quickly word of a stone staircase behind an old barn could travel through a small county. She only knew, standing there in the fading afternoon light, with Hank watching her of a reaction, that in the span of 3 days she had gone from worrying about a flooded field to fighting for the farm itself on two separate fronts she had never expected, with a third one now apparently walking her own property line, uninvited, and taking photographs of something she had not yet fully understood herself. Hank asked her, watching her turn the card over in her fingers, whether she wanted him to run the man off the property if he came back without an invitation. She told him not yet, that she did not know enough about any of this to start making enemies out of strangers, and Hank told her that was probably the right instinct, though he did not look entirely convinced by his own advice. He asked her, more carefully than she expected, whether she was doing all right. Not about the field, not about the wall, but about all of it together, the funeral still barely 2 months behind her, and now a lawyer's voicemail and a stranger's business card arriving in the same week. She told him she did not have time to answer that question honestly, not yet, and he nodded once and did not push her further, which was, she was beginning to understand, exactly the kind of thing Hank did instead of saying he cared. She folded the card into her pocket, told Hank she would deal with it in the morning, and went back out behind the barn one more time before dark, not to dig, but simply to stand at the top of the 12-stone steps and feel the cold air still moving steadily through the gap at the bottom, patient and unbothered by any of it, exactly as it had been for longer than anyone currently fighting over this land had been alive to notice. Wade Pruitt called before Bryn had finished her coffee the next morning, and she let it ring twice before she answered, mostly to prove to herself that she could. His voice was warm in the practiced way of a man who made his living being liked by strangers. He said he hoped Hank passed along his apologies for walking the property line without asking first, that he simply got excited when he saw what looked like an old stone structure and could not help himself. He said he ran a small development company out of Harrisburg, mostly restoring old farm properties into what he called heritage retreats, weekend places for city families, who wanted a taste of rural Pennsylvania without the debt that came with actually running a farm. He told her a little about his business, as though she had asked, describing 2 other properties his company had recently converted, a stone spring house turned into a guest cottage 2 counties over, an old grain silo repurposed into what he called a signature architectural feature for a wedding venue. He spoke about these projects with real enthusiasm, and Bryn found herself, despite everything, briefly unable to decide whether the man on the phone believed sincerely in what he was selling or had simply gotten very good at sounding like he did. He said he had been quietly buying options on land throughout the valley for the better part of 2 years, and that a piece of Fallow Ridge, specifically the back acreage near the Hawthorne line, would round out something he had been assembling for a while. Bryn asked him how he had heard about the steps behind her barn at all, since she had told exactly 3 people. He laughed, easy and unbothered, and said that in a county this size, 3 people was more than enough. He told her he was not asking her to sell the whole farm, just the back parcel, the ground behind the barn and down to the boundary line, at a price he described as more than generous, given what he called the limited agricultural value of that particular stretch of ground. She told him she was not selling anything. He said he understood that it was a big decision, that he did not expect an answer on the spot, and that he would check back with her once she had time to think it over properly. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that a girl her age running a farm alone, especially one with legal complications hanging over it, might find a clean cash offer more useful than she currently realized. She asked him before she let herself hang up how a man from Harrisburg happened to know she was dealing with any legal complications at all, since she had not mentioned Dale's name to a single soul outside her own kitchen table and Corinne's office. There was a brief pause on the line, just long enough to notice, before he told her that a county this size did not keep many secrets for long, and that a filing at the Register of Wills office was a public record any interested party could look up in an afternoon if they knew where to check. He said it lightly, almost as a joke at his own expense for having done exactly that, but the ease of it unsettled her more than if he had simply refused to answer. She hung up without answering that part at all, and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand still salt on the phone, turning over the particular way he had said complications, as though he already knew more about Dale's filing than a stranger from Harrisburg had any business knowing. She did not have time to sit with the thought for long. Corinne called an hour later asking her to come into town, her voice carrying a note of urgency that had not been there during their previous conversations. Bryn found her behind the same scarred desk, a thin folder open in front of her that had clearly come from somewhere deep in her filing cabinets rather than anything recent. Corinne told her that after their conversation about Dale, she had gone back through her own old case files from her early years working with Silas, well before she had drafted his final will, back to a period nearly 15 years earlier when Silas had first come to her about a completely different matter. At the time, an out-of-state buyer had approached him about purchasing a section of the property, specifically the ground behind the barn, offering what Corinne's old notes described as an unusually aggressive price for land that produced nothing and grew nothing. Silas had refused without explanation and had asked Corinne, in writing, to add a private note to his file stating clearly that no portion of that particular acreage was ever to be sold or subdivided under any circumstances, regardless of who asked or how much they offered. Bryn asked her who the buyer had been. Corinne turned the folder around so Bryn could read the old letterhead herself. The company no longer existed under that name, but the address matched a business registration history that, according to a quick search Corinne had run that morning, eventually folded into a series of smaller regional developers, one of which had been absorbed 8 years ago into a company currently doing business as Pruitt Heritage Holdings. Bryn read the letter twice, her uncle's own words preserved in the careful formal language lawyers used to record instructions that mattered. No portion of the acreage lying behind the main barn structure, extending to the property boundary marked by the Hawthorne line, shall under any circumstance be sold, leased, subdivided, or otherwise transferred, regardless of any offer received, present or future. She asked Corinne what would make a man write something that permanent about a patch of ground that, on paper, produced nothing and cost him money in taxes every single year he owned it. Corinne told her she had asked herself the same question 15 years ago, and that Silas had given her nothing beyond a single sentence at the time, which she still remembered clearly enough to repeat word for word. He had told her that some ground was not his to sell because it had never really been only his in the first place. She had assumed then it was simply the kind of thing an old farmer said about land. In general, the sort of sentiment men of his generation sometimes wrapped around ordinary stubbornness. She said she understood it rather differently now. Bryn sat very still with the old letter in her hands, feeling something shift into place that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with understanding. For the first time, that her uncle had spent the last 15 years of his life quietly protecting a piece of ground from exactly the kind of offer that had just come through her phone that morning. She told Corinne about the wall, the cold air, the stone steps, all of it, and watched the lawyer's expression change from professional concern into something closer to genuine unease. Corinne told her plainly that whatever was behind that wall was very likely the reason Silas had refused every offer for 15 years without ever telling anyone why, and that Bryn needed to understand exactly what she was protecting before she made any decision about it at all, legal or otherwise. Bryn drove home with the old letter photocopied and folded into her jacket pocket, and by the time she reached the farm, the light was already slanting low across the yard. She did not wait for morning. She went straight to the barn, gathered a hammer and a bolster chisel from the workbench, and walked out to the 12 stone steps, with Hank following a few paces behind her, saying nothing, simply present in the way he had been present through every difficult hour since Silas died. She worked from the base of the sealed wall upward, exactly as Corinne had suggested when she first raised the idea of documenting things carefully, releasing each mortared stone individually, rather than knocking the whole structure through at once. It took most of the evening and into the following afternoon, her hands blistering under Silas's oversized gloves, Hank taking over for an hour at a time when her arms gave out, neither of them saying much beyond the occasional instruction about angle and leverage. By Sunday morning, the wall was gone, and she descended the 12 steps into daylight for the first time since the gap at the bottom had first breathed cold air across her hand. The space beyond was larger than she had expected. A long stone chamber stretching back into the hillside, roughly 22 feet by 11, with an arched ceiling, just under 7 feet at its highest point. The walls were built from the same warm sandstone as the staircase, laid in careful courses with old lime mortar still holding firm after more than a century. The floor was flagged in flat stone, and at the far end a set of shallow shelves had been built directly into the wall in 2 tiers, each about 18 inches deep. Along both of the longer walls, evenly spaced, hung rusted iron hooks, 9 on each side, set at a consistent height just above her own head. The stone beneath every single hook had darkened and worn smooth, as though something had hung there, been removed, and hung there again, over and over, for decades. She checked the temperature with the thermometer she had brought down from the kitchen, 46 degrees. She checked it again 2 days later, and it had not moved by a single degree in either direction, regardless of the heat building outside through the last weeks of summer. She stood counting the iron hooks a second time, 9 on each side, 18 in total, and tried to imagine what it must have taken to fill all 18 of them at once during a good season. Entire families' worth of cured meat and wrapped cheese hanging in careful rows in the cold dark, tended by 4 sets of hands that had agreed, somehow, not to take more than their fair share of a space none of them could have built alone. Near the ceiling at each end of the vault, just below where the arch began to curve, she found narrow openings lined with old clay pipe, angled upward through the earth toward the surface. 4 in total. When she walked the Hawthorne line later that same afternoon, she found their exits hidden beneath decades of undergrowth. Small stone-capped vents barely visible at ground level, built to draw a slow current of cool air through the chamber below without ever letting frost or damp take hold of it. Whoever had built this had understood something about moving air and controlling temperature that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with careful, deliberate engineering, achieved without electricity, without refrigeration, using nothing but stone, angle, and an understanding of how cold air settles and warm air rises. She noticed, running her hand along the flagged floor, that it sloped almost imperceptibly toward a narrow channel cut down the center of the room, invisible until she crouched low enough to see it catch the light from her flashlight. She traced it with her fingers to where it disappeared beneath the far wall, clearly built to carry away any moisture that gathered on the stone, keeping the walls dry enough that nothing inside would ever spoil damp the way it would have in an ordinary cellar dug without the same care. It was the kind of detail, she understood, that only revealed itself to someone willing to get down on the ground and look, which told her something about the people who had built it. They had not simply wanted a hole in the earth that stayed cold. They had wanted something that would work correctly for as long as anyone bothered to maintain it, long after they themselves were gone. Hank came down the steps behind her that first morning, having heard the sound of the falling stones from the barn. and come to see what she had finally broken through. He stood in the middle of the flagged floor, turning slowly in place, running one hand along the nearest iron hook, and told her, in the fewest words she had ever heard him use, that he had worked this farm for 19 years and never once suspected there was anything under it worth finding. He said it the way a man says something that quietly rearranges what he thought he knew about a place he had considered thoroughly familiar. It was on the underside of the lower shelf, crouching to examine the joinery more closely. Carved into the sandstone, at eye level for anyone kneeling to look, 4 sets of letters arranged in a rough column. WPJMGW. And beneath those 3, cut slightly deeper than the rest, as though whoever carved it had pressed harder or cared more, BH. She sat back on her heels in the cool dark and stared at those 2 letters for a long time. The same letters that made up her own name, carved into stone by someone who had died before her own grandfather was old enough to remember him clearly. She thought about the fencing pliers still sitting on her kitchen counter. Silas's initials burned crudely into the handle with a hot nail, and understood there was something almost unbearably direct about a family that kept marking the things it valued with the same 2 letters, generation after generation, as though a name carved deep enough might outlast whatever else eventually got sold, scattered, or forgotten. She ran her thumb once across the grooves of the carved B, feeling the slight roughness where the chisel had caught the grain of the stone differently than it had for the other letters, evidence of an unsteady hand or perhaps simple haste, and found herself wondering, not for the first time that week, what kind of man had knelt exactly where she was kneeling now, and decided this particular thing was worth doing carefully. She did not have an answer, only the cold air moving steadily around her, and the quiet, settling certainty that whatever she decided to do with this place from here forward, she would be doing it as the 4th generation of someone who had once thought it mattered enough to carve his name where no one would find it for 100 years. She called Louise Bramwell that same evening, and Louise agreed to come out to the farm herself rather than wait for Bryn to bring photographs into town, which told Bryn something about how unusual this fine trulich was before Louise had even climbed down the 12 steps. Louise stood in the middle of the flagged floor with a flashlight, running her fingers along the carved initials, and told Bryn that she recognized 2 of the names almost immediately from parish and census records she had spent years studying. The Meredith family, marked by the initials J.M., had farmed a property called Higher Brackfen a mile down the valley until the early part of the last century. The initials G.W. almost certainly referred to the Whitfield family, longtime farmers on the opposite side of the county road, still represented today by a single living descendant Louise happened to know personally. The W.P., she said carefully, watching Bryn's face as she said it, most likely stood for a family named Pruitt, recorded in the 1890 census as smallholders working a modest parcel that had since been absorbed into larger farms over the generations that followed. She said the Pruitt name appeared in local records for roughly 2 more decades after that census, before it simply stopped showing up in tax rolls and church registries alike, the kind of quiet disappearance that usually meant a family had sold out and moved on rather than dying out entirely. She added, almost as an afterthought, that a few Pruitt descendants had reportedly resettled somewhere in the eastern part of the state, though she had never had reason to trace the line any further than that until today. Bryn felt the name land somewhere behind her ribs. She asked Louise if there was any possible connection between that Pruitt family and a man currently doing business under the name Pruitt Heritage Holdings. Louise admitted she had no way of confirming a direct line without deeper genealogical research, but that the coincidence, if it was one, seemed unlikely given how uncommon the name was in that particular corner of the county. And the beach, Louise said quietly, was almost certainly a Holt. She stood a while, longer studying the carved letters, then told Bryn that in over 20 years of doing this work, she had never once had the chance to stand in a structure like this one, fully intact, its purpose still legible in the stone itself, its builder's name still readable a century and a half later. She said most of what she handled at the archive existed only on paper, brittle documents describing things long since torn down or built over, and that walking down 12 stones into something that still worked exactly as its builders intended was, for her, closer to a privilege than a task. Bryn stood very still in the cool dark of the vault. Her own initials had been carved into more than a century before she was born, and understood, for the first time in a way that went beyond paperwork and property lines, that whatever Wade Pruitt believed he was trying to buy might be something his own family had helped build, and then somewhere along the way had chosen to walk away from. She did not have long to sit with that realization before the next confrontation arrived, and this one came through the front door rather than a phone call. She spent the morning before Patricia's visit walking the Hawthorne line alone, tracing the four small vent caps she had found weeks earlier, running her hand along the moss-covered stone of each one, trying to see the structure the way an outsider might see it for the first time, not as her own discovery, but as something that now belonged, at least in part, to whatever the state decided it was worth protecting. It was a strange feeling, standing on ground she had cleared with her own hands, already beginning to sense that ownership and belonging were not always going to mean the same thing going forward. A woman named Patricia Voss introduced herself on the porch 2 days later, holding a laminated identification badge from the State Historic Preservation Office and a folder thick enough that Bryn understood immediately. This was not a casual visit. Patricia explained, in the measured tone of someone who had delivered this particular speech many times before, that her office had received a report she declined to say from whom, describing a possible 19th century cooperative storage structure on the Holt property, and that she was there to conduct a preliminary assessment. Bryn walked her out to the vault and stood back, while Patricia moved through it with a small notebook, photographing the ventilation shafts, the worn stone beneath the iron hooks, the carved initials, occasionally murmuring to herself in a way that made Bryn increasingly uneasy. When they climbed back up into daylight, Patricia told her plainly that in her professional opinion, the structure very likely qualified for consideration on the State Historic Register, given both its age and the unusual sophistication of its design. She explained that if the property was formally designated, certain protections would apply, protections that would prevent Bryn from altering, damaging, or in some cases even fully controlling access to the site without state review and approval. She mentioned, almost in passing, that designated sites sometimes required scheduled public access for historical or educational purposes, a detail she delivered as though it were a minor administrative footnote rather than the loss of Bryn's ability to decide who walked down her own stone steps. Bryn asked her what would happen if she refused to allow the designation process to move forward at all. Patricia told her, not unkindly, that Bryn did have some say in the matter as the property owner, but that a structure of genuine historical significance sometimes drew attention regardless of what the owner preferred, particularly once word of it began circulating locally, which Patricia gently implied it already had. Bryn asked her, more sharply than she intended, whether the state's interest in the vault had anything to do with the fact that a private developer had recently been asking her to sell the exact same ground. Patricia's expression flickered, brief but real, before she told her she was not at liberty to discuss the source of the report that had brought her office's attention to the property, though she added, more carefully than before, that her role had nothing to do with helping any private buyer acquire anything. Her only interest, she said, was in making sure something historically significant was not lost through neglect, damage, or an owner's decision to demolish or bury it again before its value could be properly recorded. Bryn told her that was not especially reassuring given how the conversation had gone so far, and Patricia, to her credit, did not argue the point. She said she understood how it looked, arriving with a folder and a badge only weeks after Bryn had made a private discovery on her own land, but that her office genuinely operated on a different set of concerns than a real estate transaction, even if the timing made that distinction hard to feel from where Bryn was standing. She left a business card and a stack of informational pamphlets and told Bryn she would follow up within 2 weeks to discuss next steps, framing it as a courtesy rather than a deadline, though it landed as both. Bryn read through the pamphlets that evening at the kitchen table, dense paragraphs about registration criteria and easement language that told her little beyond confirming how far outside her depth she currently was. One line, printed in bold near the back of the shortest pamphlet, stayed with her longer than the rest. Historic designation protects a structure for the benefit of the public record. It does not, by itself, guarantee the interests of the current property owner. She read it twice, then set the pamphlet down and sat with the particular unease of understanding that the very thing she had spent a week fighting to keep private might soon belong, in some official sense, to everyone but her. Bryn stood in the yard, holding the pamphlets after Patricia's car pulled away. and understood that she was now being pulled at from two directions that could not be more different from each other in purpose, yet somehow agreed on exactly one thing, that the decision about what happened to that vault belonged to someone other than the 18-year-old girl who actually owned the ground above it. She had barely finished putting the pamphlets down on the kitchen table when Corinne called again, her voice tighter than before, telling Bryn that Dale's attorney had filed an emergency motion that morning, requesting a temporary restraining order, preventing any alteration, sale, or transfer of any portion of the Holt property until the underlying will contest was resolved. Bryn asked what that meant in practical terms. Corinne told her it meant, if the judge granted it, that Bryn would be legally barred from doing much of anything with the land itself while the case was pending, potentially including any formal historic preservation agreement Patricia's office might propose, and possibly even complicating her ability to secure additional operating credit from the bank while the harvest loan payment loomed closer. A hearing had already been scheduled to consider the motion, set for the following Thursday, which happened to fall on the exact date Patricia had mentioned for her own follow-up visit. Bryn sat at the kitchen table that night with three separate deadlines converging on the same week, the bank loan payment drawing closer regardless of anything else happening around it, and felt for the first time since the funeral something closer to real panic than simple exhaustion. Roger Delling from the bank called the morning after Patricia's visit, before Bryn had a chance to process any of it. He told her, in the same careful tone he had used weeks earlier, that he was simply checking in ahead of the season's end, and that he had heard, through the ordinary channel of small-town gossip, that there was some kind of legal matter developing around the estate. He asked her, not unreasonably, whether anything about her ownership of the farm itself was currently in question, since the bank would need to know if there was any risk to the collateral behind her uncle's loan. Bryn told him the will contest did not change her ownership of the property, only complicated the timeline, and he told her he was glad to hear it, though something in his voice suggested he intended to keep a closer eye on the situation than he had before. He asked, too, whether she had heard anything further from the developer, whose name had apparently already reached him through the same small-town channels that carried everything else, and Bryn told him only that she had received an offer she had no intention of accepting, which seemed to satisfy him for the moment. He reminded her gently but plainly that the payment date had not moved and that the bank's patience with an estate in transition had limits like anyone else's. She hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a while afterward, the pamphlets from Patricia still stacked beside the bank statement, both of them representing a version of pressure that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with the same 12-stone steps behind her barn. She found Gareth Whitfield's name through Louise the following afternoon, a retired school teacher in his 70s, living in a small house 3 miles from the farm, the last living descendant of the family whose initials sat carved into the vault wall beside her own. Louise had his contact information from a talk he had given, years earlier, to the County Historical Society about farming life in the valley during the early 20th century, and she called ahead so he would not be caught entirely off guard by a stranger asking about his family history. He arrived at the farm on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a lean man with a walking stick and an expression of polite skepticism that Bryn watched shift into something else entirely the moment she led him down the 12-stone steps. He stood in the middle of the flagged floor for a long time without speaking, running one hand slowly along the edge of the lower shelf. He crouched with some difficulty to look at the carved initials and stayed crouched there long enough that Bryn began to worry about his knees before he finally spoke. "My grandmother mentioned this," he said. "I always thought it was just a figure of speech. She used to say her father knew where the cold was kept." He straightened up slowly, one hand still resting against the stone. "He was a practical man," Gareth said. "They all were back then. Nobody built something like this for themselves alone. It only worked because 4 families agreed to share the labor and share the use of it, which meant trusting each other with something valuable, in a way most neighbors never had to." Bryn asked him how 4 families who farmed separate pieces of land had ever agreed to build something like this together in the first place, when neighbors just as often argued over fence lines and water as they cooperated on anything. Gareth told her his grandmother had explained it to him once, years before he had any real reason to remember the details carefully. The 4 families had come to the arrangement, as she told it, After a particularly hard summer, sometime in the 1870s, when spoiled meat and ruined cheese had cost every one of them dearly within the same few months. None of them alone had the labor or the money to build proper cold storage. Together, pooling stonemasons, hauling teams, and enough hands to move the earth in a reasonable season, they managed something none of them could have managed apart. He said his grandmother always framed it less as generosity and more as plain arithmetic. Four families each contributing a quarter of what an impossible project cost, walking away with something considerably better than a quarter share of anything they could have built alone. Bryn asked him gently what he remembered about why it had been sealed. He told her what little he knew, passed down mostly as fragments rather than a full story. The Meredith had been sold out of the family before the 1940s. The Wiltons, another name Louise had mentioned in earlier records, had left the valley even earlier than that. Home refrigerators had begun appearing across rural Pennsylvania during those same years. Expensive and not yet universal, but common enough to make a shared underground vault feel like something from an older, harder era that people were eager to leave behind. As the families who had built it and maintained it scattered, one by one, there had simply been no one left with a reason to keep climbing down those 12 steps. He paused, looking toward the sealed gap where the wall had once stood, and added that someone had eventually closed the entrance, not out of secrecy, but likely out of plain practical concern that an open stone stairwell behind a working barn was a hazard waiting to happen to livestock or to a careless child. Bryn told him gently that his own family's initials, along with a Pruitt, sat carved into the shelf beside her own, and watched his expression change again, this time into something more guarded. Gareth told her, choosing his words with visible care, that the Pruitt family had left the valley under circumstances his grandmother had never spoken about kindly, something involving a dispute over water rights and shared costs that had turned the four families against each other for a period before whatever agreement they eventually reached to keep the vault running. He said he could not tell her more than that with any confidence, since it had happened before his own mother was born, but that the bitterness of it had apparently lasted long enough to still color his grandmother's voice whenever the name came up decades later. Bryn thanked him for coming, walked him back up the 12 steps into daylight, and stood in the yard afterward turning over what he had told her, understanding now that whatever history connected her family to Wade Pruitt's ran considerably deeper and considerably more complicated than a stranger simply trying to buy land he had no prior claim to. Wade called again that same evening, and this time his voice had lost some of its earlier warmth, replaced by something more direct. He told her he had heard, through channels he did not specify, about both the historic preservation inquiry and the restraining order motion Dale's attorney had filed, and that given how complicated things were clearly becoming for her, his offer for the back parcel now included something additional. He said he had connections, through his business, to attorneys experienced in exactly the kind of a dispute she was currently facing, and that if she agreed to sell him the parcel now, before the court hearing, he would personally see to it that those connections were made available to her at no cost, potentially resolving her difficulties with Dale far faster and far more cheaply than fighting it out in court over many months. Bryn asked him, very quietly, whether he was aware that his own family's name was carved into the wall of the very structure he was trying to buy. There was a pause on the line, brief but unmistakable, before he told her he was not sure what she meant, though something in the careful neutrality of his voice told her. He understood exactly what she meant and had simply not expected her to know it yet. She asked him, before she let him go, what exactly he thought resolving her difficulties with Dale would look like, coming from a man who had never met either of them until a business card appeared wedged in her porch door. He told her it was simple. Estate disputes like this one dragged on for months, sometimes years, and cost more in legal fees than most families ever recovered, regardless of who ultimately won. A quick, clean sale of a parcel neither she nor Dale currently had any real use for would take the entire dispute off the table before it had the chance to consume a season of her life and a considerable portion of whatever the estate was actually worth. He said he was simply offering her a faster, cheaper way out of a fight she had not asked to be part of. She told him that the parcel he kept describing as having no real use was the same parcel her uncle had refused to sell for 15 years, according to his own written instructions, and asked him again more directly this time, whether that gave him any pause at all. He told her, after a pause of his own, that a man's private reasons for refusing an offer decades ago did not obligate his heir to refuse the same offer today. And that sentiment, however understandable, rarely paid a bank loan on time. She told him she needed time to think and hung up before he could answer, standing in the kitchen with her heart beating harder than the conversation alone should have caused. It was Hank who gave her the final piece she had not yet been looking for. Later that same night, when she found him in the equipment shed, replacing a belt on the old baler by lantern light rather than sleeping, much the same as she had been doing herself. She told him everything: the vault, the initials, Patricia's visit, the restraining order, Wade's connection to a family that had apparently helped build the very thing he now wanted to buy out from under her. Hank listened without interrupting, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he told her something he said he had never seen a reason to mention before, since it had never seemed important until now. Years earlier, not long after Bryn had first come to live at the farm as a child, Dale had actually visited once. Just once, and only for a single strained afternoon that Hank remembered mostly because of how it ended. Dale had pressed his father hard that day about selling off what he called the useless back acreage behind the barn, arguing that a buyer had approached him directly with an aggressive offer, and that Silas was being stubborn and foolish for refusing it without explanation. Silas had refused to discuss it further, had told Dale plainly that some things on this farm were not his to sell and never would be. And the visit had ended with Dale driving off angry and not returning again until after his father was already dead. Hank told her he had never known who that buyer was, only that Silas had been visibly shaken by the conversation, in a way Hank had rarely seen from him before or since. He remembered Silas standing in the yard long after Dale's car disappeared down the drive, staring at the ground behind the barn, as though it had personally betrayed him by attracting the kind of attention he had spent years trying to keep away from it. Bryn asked him why he had never mentioned any of this before, not even in passing, in the 6 months since Silas died. Hank told her plainly that it had never seemed like his story to tell. It belonged to Silas and to Dale, two men who had apparently settled something between them, however badly, long before Bryn was old enough to be part of any of it. He said he had assumed, wrongly it now seemed, that whatever the argument had actually been about had died along with the two of them, one estranged and one buried, and that dredging it up without a clear reason would only have stirred up grief that already had enough places to come from. Bryn told him she understood, and meant it, though some part of her also understood that the silence Hank had kept out of respect had cost her nearly a full season of not knowing something that might have mattered from the very beginning. Bryn stood in the lantern light, with the pieces finally arranging themselves into a single shape. Dale had known, or at least suspected, that something valuable sat behind that barn years before Bryn had ever swung the first pick into the pile of scrap metal covering it. He had tried to convince his own father to sell it once already, had been refused, and had walked away from the entire family rather than accept that answer, only to return the moment his father died to challenge the will that kept that same ground out of his hands a second time. She thought of Wade's careful hesitation on the phone only hours earlier, of the aggressive early offer Corinne's old files described, of a Pruitt family that had left the valley under circumstances bitter enough to still echo in Gareth Whitfield's voice 2 generations later, and understood that these were not 3 separate problems circling her at once by coincidence. They were the same problem, wearing different faces, returning to finish something that had apparently never actually settled, but only postponed. The way the scrap metal behind the barn had been postponed for 40 years until the ground itself finally forced the issue. Her phone buzzed once more before she went to bed that night. A message from Corinne confirming the court had officially scheduled Dale's restraining order hearing for Thursday morning, the same day Patricia Voss had marked for her own follow-up visit regarding the historic designation, and the same day Bryn realized with a cold drop in her stomach as she checked the calendar pinned beside the refrigerator that Wade Pruitt had quietly set as the deadline for his final offer, before he said he would, in his words, need to consider other properties in the valley instead. She called Corinne one last time before she finally allowed herself to sleep, less to ask a question than simply to hear another voice confirm that Thursday was real and coming regardless of how unprepared she felt for it. Corinne told her, patiently, that the restraining order hearing was a legal matter with a legal process, that Patricia's office operated on its own separate timeline regardless of what happened in court, and that Wade Pruitt's deadline was, in the end, nothing more than a sales tactic dressed up as urgency. She told Bryn that the only thing that genuinely needed to happen by Thursday morning was showing up to the hearing prepared, and that everything else circling her that week could wait exactly as long as she needed it to wait. Bryn asked her quietly whether she thought Bryn could actually keep all of it, the farm, the vault, the fight with Dale, without losing something important in the process. Corinne told her she did not know the answer to that yet, and that anyone who claimed certainty about how a week like this one would end was not being honest with her. What she did know, she said, was that Silas had spent 15 years protecting exactly this outcome without ever explaining himself to anyone, which suggested he believed it was worth protecting regardless of the cost. She told Bryn that belief did not have to answer every question by itself, but it was not nothing either, and it might be the steadiest thing she had to stand on when Thursday finally arrived. Three separate pressures, three separate people, all converging on the exact same morning, each one capable on its own of taking something from her that she had only just learned. In the space of a single week, she actually understood the value of enough to want to keep. Thursday arrived the way difficult days always seem to arrive lately, without any patience for how ready or unready Bryn actually felt for it. She dressed in the one dark blue dress she owned, the same one she had worn to Silas's funeral 2 months earlier, and drove into town with Corinne's number already pulled up on her phone in case anything changed before she reached the courthouse steps. She had not slept well, running through Corinne's advice from the night before in her head on a loop. Answer only what is asked. Do not volunteer. Let the paperwork speak first. Hank had offered that morning to come with her, standing in the kitchen doorway in his good shirt, and she had told him no, not because she did not want him there, but because she needed to know she could stand in that courtroom on her own 2 feet, the same way she had learned to stand in front of a bank loan officer and a county archivist, a business card over the past several weeks. The county courthouse sat 2 blocks from Corinne's office, a squat brick building, with a metal detector just inside the door and a hallway that smelled faintly of floor wax and old radiators. Corinne met her outside the courtroom, carrying a leather folder thick with documents, and told her quietly that the judge hearing the restraining order motion that morning was known locally for moving quickly and for having little patience with arguments that felt more personal than legal. Dale was already seated at the opposing table when Bryn walked in, his own attorney beside him, a younger man in an expensive suit who kept glancing at his watch as though this hearing was simply one stop on a longer schedule. Dale did not look at Bryn directly. He stared at the folder in front of him, jaw tight, in a way that told her he had rehearsed whatever he intended to say and did not trust himself to hold on to it if he looked up too soon. The hearing itself moved faster than Bryn expected. Dale's attorney argued that the estate involved significant undisclosed real property, meaning the vault and its potential historic value, and that his client's interests required the court to freeze any action on the land until ownership itself was fully resolved. He mentioned, almost offhandedly, that his client had reason to believe there had been prior interest from at least one commercial buyer, which he suggested proved the land carried value Silas Holt had deliberately concealed from the estate planning process years earlier. When Corinne rose to respond, she did something Bryn had not expected. Instead of arguing generally about the strength of the will, she opened her folder and produced the old letter from 15 years earlier, the one confirming that Silas had specifically instructed his attorney, in writing, that the back acreage was never to be sold under any circumstances, regardless of any offer, and that the same acreage had since been identified as the site of a historically significant 19th century structure built cooperatively by 4 founding families of the valley, one of whose descendants was prepared to testify to its history and importance. She told the court plainly that, far from concealing value, Silas Holt had spent the final 15 years of his life actively protecting that value from exactly the kind of outside pressure his own estate was now facing, and that granting a restraining order based on suspicion of concealment made little sense when the historical record showed the opposite. The judge asked, with visible curiosity, whether the buyer referenced 15 years earlier had ever been identified. Corinne answered that recent research tied the original offer to a business entity that had, through several changes of ownership over the years, eventually become part of a company now known as Pruitt Heritage Holdings, currently run by a man named Wade Pruitt, whose own family name appeared carved into the vault wall itself alongside three other founding families, including the Holts. Dale's attorney objected that any of this was relevant to the narrow question in front of the court, which was simply whether the property should be frozen pending resolution of the will contest. The judge overruled him, telling the room he found it entirely relevant to understanding whether Silas Holt's silence about the property represented concealment, as the petition alleged, or something closer to protection, which was a very different thing under the law. Corinne pressed the point further, telling the judge that a man who instructs his attorney in writing, 15 years before his death, that a piece of land is never to be sold under any circumstance, is not a man hiding an asset for personal gain. He is a man guarding something he believes belongs to more people than himself. She said the State Historic Preservation Office had already begun its own independent assessment of the structure, entirely apart from this proceeding, which further undercut any suggestion that its existence had been secreted away for private benefit. Dale's head came up sharply at that. Bryn watched something shift across his face, confusion first, then a kind of dawning unease, as though a piece of information he had not previously had access to was rearranging something he had believed for a very long time. The judge denied the restraining order from the bench, telling both attorneys that nothing in the record suggested concealment or misconduct on Silas Holt's part, and that the underlying will contest could proceed on its own separate timeline without freezing the property in the meantime. He added, almost as an aside, that any party with a genuine interest in a historically significant structure would be better served cooperating with preservation authorities than fighting over control of it in a contested probate matter. The gavel came down lighter than Bryn expected for something that had kept her awake 3 nights running, and the courtroom began to empty around her before she had fully absorbed that the immediate threat was gone. Dale caught her in the hallway outside, alone, his attorney already a few steps ahead and out of earshot. He asked her, quietly and without the sharpness he had carried onto the porch weeks earlier, whether it was true that a Pruitt had tried to buy that land from his father once before. Bryn told him it was true, and told him what Hank had shared with her only 2 nights earlier, that Dale himself had once pressed his father hard to accept a similar offer during the one visit he had made to the farm as a younger man, and that Silas had refused him just as firmly as he had apparently refused every buyer who came after. Dale was quiet for a long moment, standing in a hallway that smelled of floor wax, and told her he remembered that afternoon differently than she seemed to. He said he had believed for years that his father's refusal was simply stubbornness, an old man clinging to worthless land out of spite rather than reason, and that the memory of being turned away that day was part of why he had stopped trying to reach his father again afterward. He looked past her down the hallway for a moment, toward the doors leading back out into the afternoon light, before he spoke again, quieter this time, almost to himself. He said it was a strange thing, carrying an entire understanding of a man for 20 years, building an entire grievance out of it, only to have a single afternoon in a courthouse hallway put a crack through the whole foundation of it. He told her that growing up, his mother had described his father as a cold man, someone who chose a piece of dirt over his own son without a second thought, and that he had carried that description for most of his adult life, without ever questioning whether it was complete. He said, hearing now that the same man had spent 15 years defending that piece of dirt against outside buyers in writing, without telling a single person why, did not fit cleanly into the story he had grown up believing. Bryn told him she understood that feeling better than he might expect, since she had spent 6 months assuming she knew everything worth knowing about her uncle, only to discover in the span of a single week that there had been an entire son, an entire history, and an entire buried structure she had never once suspected existed. He asked her, and his voice cracked slightly on the question in a way that told her it cost him something to ask it. What was actually down there? Bryn told him plainly, without elaboration, that it was something 4 families had built together over 100 years ago, something that had worked without electricity or machinery for decades, and that his own father had apparently spent the last 15 years of his life protecting it from people who only ever saw it as a piece of ground worth selling. Dale did not answer that right away. He looked down the hallway toward the exit doors, then back at her, and told her he would think about what she had said, and left without another word about the lawsuit at all. Corinne found her a few minutes later and told her, watching Dale's retreating figure through the glass doors, that whatever happened next between Bryn and Dale was no longer really a legal matter. The court had ruled. The rest of it, she said, was going to be up to the two of them. Wade Pruitt was waiting outside on the courthouse steps. Bryn saw him before he saw her, leaning against a black sedan parked at the curb, phone in hand, dressed in the same clean jacket he had worn the first day he knocked photographs of her property into his phone from the Hawthorne line. He straightened when she came down the steps and offered a smile that did not quite reach the rest of his face. He told her he had heard how the hearing went, congratulated her on it in a tone that suggested he considered the outcome only a minor delay rather than any real defeat, and told her his offer for the back parcel still stood, in fact had increased, given how much attention the property was clearly starting to attract from the State Preservation Office. He named a figure that was, by any honest measure, more money than Bryn had ever imagined attached to 210 acres of hill country farmland, enough to clear the operating loan entirely, repair every failing structure on the property, and leave a cushion behind that would let her stop lying awake, doing math in her head every night. She stood on the courthouse steps with Corinne beside her, and Dale's car still visible pulling out of the parking lot down the block, and asked Wade directly whether he knew his own family's initials were carved into the wall of the exact structure he was trying to buy. He did not deny it this time. He told her, with the first real flicker of discomfort she had seen from him, that he had learned of it only recently, through the same channels that had told him about the historic preservation inquiry, and that it changed nothing about the offer as far as he was concerned. He said his family had left that valley generations ago, over a dispute that had nothing to do with him personally, that whatever his ancestors had built or believed in was not his responsibility to preserve, and that a fair price for a piece of unused land was still a fair price, regardless of who had once carved their name into a wall on it. Bryn told him that Gareth Whitfield remembered the dispute differently, as something involving water rights and shared costs that had ended with his own family walking away from an agreement. 4 families had built together in good faith, and asked him whether that sounded to him like the kind of thing a fair price could simply erase. Wade's jaw tightened. He told her, more directly than he had allowed himself before, that sentiment did not pay bank loans, and that she, of all people, staring down a harvest loan and a legal fight and a stranger's business card in her jacket pocket, ought to understand that better than anyone standing on these steps. He said it was easy to talk about what 4 families built 100 years ago when she was not the one standing to lose the farm itself over an unpaid loan. He told her he had seen this pattern before in a dozen other valleys. Families holding on to something out of principle, right up until the bank stopped extending patience, and that principle rarely covered a mortgage payment when the moment actually arrived. Bryn told him that she had already spoken to the bank herself, and that whatever happened with the loan, it would not be decided by a stranger standing on courthouse steps trying to buy something his own family had walked away from a century earlier. Bryn felt something settle inside her then, cold and clear, the same steadiness she had felt kneeling in the vault the night she first read her own initials carved into stone by someone who had died before she was born. She told him no. She told him the land was not for sale, not the back parcel, not any part of it, not now and not later, regardless of what number he attached to the offer, and that whatever his family had walked away from 100 years ago, hers had spent every year since choosing to stay and protect what 4 families had built together, and she did not intend to be the Holt who finally let it go. Wade studied her for a long moment on the courthouse steps, the practiced warmth gone entirely from his face now, replaced by something flatter and more businesslike. He told her the offer would not stay open forever, that land like this did not sell itself twice, and that she might regret the decision the next time the bank called about the loan. She told him she would take that risk. He got into his car without another word and pulled away from the curb, and Bryn stood on the steps beside Corinne, feeling her own heartbeat slow for what felt like the first time in over a week, the refusal sitting in her chest, not like a loss, but like something finally settled and solid. She watched his sedan turn out of the parking lot and thought, briefly, about the 1890 census entry Louise had shown her only weeks earlier, a Pruitt family working a modest parcel not far from where she now stood, and wondered what it must have been like for that family to walk away from something 4 neighbors had built together, whatever the reason, and to carry that decision forward far enough that a great-grandson could stand on a courthouse street a century later and see nothing in an old stone vault but a number attached to acreage. She did not feel triumphant watching him go. She felt instead something closer to sadness for a family that had once had a claim to exactly the kind of belonging she had only discovered for herself over the past several weeks, and had somewhere along the way simply let it go. Corinne squeezed her arm once and told her quietly that whatever else happened with the loan, she had just watched a young woman make a decision most people 3 times her age would have struggled to make under half that pressure. They walked together to Corinne's car, and before Bryn climbed into her own truck, Corinne told her one more thing, unprompted. She said she had represented Silas for 11 years without ever once suspecting the quiet stubbornness she saw in him during ordinary estate planning conversations was actually loyalty to something he had never explained. She said watching Bryn refuse Wade Pruitt on those same steps, without hesitation, without needing anyone to tell her it was the right thing to do, had answered a question about the two of them, uncle and niece, that Corinne had been quietly wondering about since the day she first read Silas's will aloud in her office. Bryn asked her what question that was. Corinne told her she had wondered whether whatever it was that made Silas Holt the man he was would carry forward into the girl he raised, or whether it would simply end with him the way so many things eventually did once the person carrying them was gone. She said she had her answer now and did not need to say anything further about it. Bryn called Gareth Whitfield that same evening to tell him how the day had gone, mostly because she had promised him she would, but partly because she had found herself wanting to hear his voice after a day that had asked more of her than any single day since the funeral. He listened to the whole account without interrupting. The restraining order denied, Dale's shift in the hallway afterward, Wade's offer, and her refusal of it on the courthouse steps. And when she finished, he was quiet long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. He told her, finally, that his grandmother would have liked knowing how this turned out. He said she had spent the last years of her life believing the vault and everything it represented had simply been lost to time. One more casualty of families scattering and refrigerators arriving and neighbors forgetting what they once built together. He told Bryn that she had, without quite meaning to, proven his grandmother wrong about that, and that it was not a small thing to prove an old woman's quiet grief wrong, even years after she was no longer alive to hear it. The loan itself did not disappear simply because Bryn had found her courage on a courthouse step, and she spent the drive home turning over what came next with a clearer head than she had managed in days. She called Roger Delling that afternoon, laid out the drainage problem honestly, the collapsed field tile finally identified and marked for repair, the crew already scheduled to come clear it the following week, and the realistic timeline for Lower Fallow to finally drain the way it should have been draining all along. Roger listened without interrupting, then told her he appreciated her calling before the payment came due rather than after, which was more than he could say for plenty of accounts twice the size of hers. He asked her directly whether the will contest was fully resolved, and she told him honestly that it was withdrawn that same week, which she could confirm in writing from her attorney if the bank needed it on file. He agreed to 30 additional days on the payment without much difficulty, told her the field tile repair sounded like exactly the kind of fix that would matter for next year's yield, and added, almost as an afterthought, that Silas had always paid his debts eventually, and he saw no reason to assume his niece would be any different. He told her, before they hung up, that he had liked Silas a great deal over the years, and that he could already see some of the same steadiness in her, which was, coming from a man who dealt in numbers and risk all day, about as warm a thing as Roger Delling ever said to anyone. He asked her, before they hung up, what she intended to do about the historic preservation matter Patricia's office had apparently opened, since word of that had reached the bank as well, through channels Bryn had stopped being surprised by at this point. She told him she was still working that out, and he told her plainly that a state designation handled correctly could actually strengthen the property's standing rather than threaten it, since land with recognized historical value, sometimes qualified for preservation grants and tax considerations, the bank would be glad to see attached to a loan they were carrying. It was not something Bryn had considered, and she found herself grateful, briefly, that at least one of the pressures circling her that month might eventually turn out to help rather than hurt. It was not everything. It bought her time, which was, for the moment, enough. Patricia Voss called 2 days later, earlier than her scheduled follow-up, saying she wanted to speak with Bryn before their official meeting, rather than simply showing up with paperwork already drafted. She drove out to the farm that same afternoon and sat with Bryn at the kitchen table, the same table where the bank statement had once sat under a magnet, now cleared for the moment of anything but 2 mugs of coffee. Patricia told her she had spent the past week researching cooperative storage structures across the state, and that what sat behind Bryn's barn was, by every measure her office used, one of the best preserved examples she had encountered in over a decade of doing this work. She said the state would very likely move forward with a historic designation, regardless of what Bryn wanted, simply because the significance was too clear to ignore once it had been documented. Bryn told her carefully that she was not opposed to the vault being recognized, only opposed to losing the ability to decide who walked down those 12 steps and when. Patricia was quiet for a moment, then told her there was a path that accomplished both. A voluntary conservation agreement, drafted with the owner's cooperation rather than imposed over her objection, could grant the structure formal historic recognition while leaving day-to-day control, access, and use in the hands of the family that owned the land above it. Scheduled visits could be arranged on the owner's terms rather than the state's, particularly if descendants of the founding families wanted a role in how the site was remembered and shared. Bryn asked her what that would actually look like in practice. Patricia suggested something simple, an annual gathering, once a year, where descendants of the families, whose initials were carved into that stone, could come down those steps together, see it, and know it was still being looked after by someone who understood what it had meant to build. The rest of the year, it would remain exactly what it already was, a working part of Bryn's farm. Bryn asked her what would happen to that agreement if she ever decided to sell the farm itself, years down the road, to someone with no connection to any of this history. Patricia told her that was exactly the kind of question the agreement was designed to answer permanently. Once recorded, the conservation terms would run with the deed itself, binding any future owner regardless of who they were or what they intended, which meant the vault's protection and its remaining in family or cooperative hands would outlast any single owner's decision, including Bryn's own if she or her descendants ever chose to part with the land. Bryn sat with that for a moment, understanding that what Patricia was describing was not so different from what Silas had done with a private note in a lawyer's file 15 years earlier, except recorded now in a way that would not depend on one man's private instruction being remembered or honored by whoever came after him. Bryn agreed to it on the spot, and Patricia left that afternoon with the beginning of an agreement between them rather than a battle. The first conversation in over a week that had ended with Bryn feeling like she had gained something rather than simply defended it. Dale came back to the farm 11 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, without calling first. Bryn watched his car come up the gravel drive from the kitchen window and felt her stomach tighten instinctively before she noticed how differently he was carrying himself this time. No folder under his arm, no attorney trailing behind him. He had come alone in his own car this time, rather than a rental, which she noticed only after he had already parked and was standing in the yard, looking up at the farmhouse the way a person looks at a place they are trying to see clearly for the first time. He told her, standing in the same doorway where he had first introduced himself weeks earlier, that he had withdrawn the will contest that morning, formally, through his attorney, and that he was not here to discuss any of it further. He said he had spent the past week thinking about what she told him in the courthouse hallway, about his father refusing him the same way he had refused Wade's family decades earlier, and that somewhere in turning it over he had stopped being angry about the will and started being angry. Instead, about all the years he had spent, assuming his father simply had not cared enough to explain himself. Bryn asked him carefully what had actually changed his mind, since a week did not seem like very long to undo a decade of believing a particular version of a man. Dale told her it was not a single thing. It was Corinne's letter, read 3 times over on his drive home from the hearing. It was Hank's account of the argument he barely remembered having with his own father, seen now from an angle he had never once considered. It was the fact that a stranger named Wade Pruitt had chased the same piece of ground for 15 years and Silas had refused him every time without wavering, which told Dale something about the strength of his father's conviction that no amount of childhood resentment could easily argue against. He asked quietly if he could see it. Bryn led him down the 12 stone steps herself, into the cool dark that had not changed a single degree since she first stood in it, and stood back, while Dale walked the length of the vault in silence, running his hand along the same worn stone beneath the iron hooks that Gareth Whitfield had once touched with his own. He found the initials on the underside of the lower shelf, and crouched to look at them the same way Gareth had, tracing the letters BH with one finger for a long moment before he straightened and told her, without looking at her directly, that he wished his father had simply told him what this was, instead of leaving him to spend a decade angry over a piece of ground he had never understood. Bryn told him gently that some things a person could not explain in words, only show, and that Silas had likely believed, rightly or wrongly, that Dale would understand eventually, one way or another. Dale asked her whether she thought that made it right, a father choosing silence over his own son, for reasons that made sense, only after the son was old enough and patient enough to walk down 12 stone steps and see it for himself. Bryn told him honestly that she did not know, that she had asked herself something close to the same question about her own place in all of this more than once over the past 2 months, and that the only answer she had settled on so far was that the ground itself did not seem to care who understood it or when, only whether someone was still willing to keep it. Dale did not answer that. He simply stood in the cool of the vault for a while longer, and when he finally climbed back up into the daylight, he told her he would like to be included. Somehow, if there was ever a gathering of the families this place belonged to. Bryn told him he already was one. The gathering happened on a clear afternoon in early October, 6 weeks after the courthouse steps arranged through Patricia's office and Louise's careful genealogical work, tracing what remained of the 4 founding families beyond the ones Bryn had already met. A Meredith descendant came from 2 counties over, a quiet woman in her 50s who had never heard the family's story firsthand and cried softly the moment she saw the initials carved beside her own family name. A distant Wilton relative came as well, an elderly man who admitted he had only learned of the connection through Louise's letter and had nearly not come at all, uncertain what claim he still had to a place his family had left behind 3 generations earlier. He told Bryn, standing at the top of the 12 steps, before he could bring himself to descend them, that his own grandfather had rarely spoken of the valley at all, and that he had grown up assuming the silence meant there was nothing there worth remembering. Seeing his own family's initials carved into the wall below, he said, felt less like discovering something new and more like being handed back a piece of himself he had not known was missing. Gareth Whitfield came leaning on his walking stick, steadier on the steps this time than his first visit, and stood beside Dale near the shelf where both their family's initials sat carved only inches apart, 2 men whose ancestors had once quarreled bitterly enough that the memory had lasted a century, standing together now in the same cool dark their families had once shared without complaint. Gareth told Dale, within Bryn's hearing, that whatever bitterness had passed between a Whitfield and a Pruitt generations ago had nothing to do with a Holt standing beside him today, and that he was glad, in the end, that it was a Holt who had found this place again, rather than letting it stay buried the way it might have if the drainage on Lower Fallow had simply held. Dale told him he was glad of that too, and the 2 men stood together a while longer without needing to say much else. Bryn watched them from across the flagged floor, 2 men who had arrived at this same gathering carrying entirely different weights, one the grandson of a family that had stayed, and one the son of a man who had almost walked away from all of it, standing now on equal footing beneath the same arched stone ceiling, and thought that whatever else came of this season she had at least managed to bring 2 threads back together, that history had left frayed for longer than either of them had been alive to remember clearly. Hank stood near the back of the group, arms crossed the way he always stood, watching Bryn move among the descendants of 4 families she had never known existed a season earlier, answering their questions about the ventilation shafts and the drainage channel with an ease that told him, more than anything else could have, how far she had traveled since the morning she first found a straight edge of stone beneath a pile of rusted scrap. At one point, the Meredith descendant asked Bryn quietly whether she had ever considered simply leaving the vault sealed once she found it, given everything it had already cost her in legal fees and sleepless nights. Bryn told her she had thought about it exactly once, the night she first felt the cold air moving through the gap at the bottom of the wall, and had decided against it before the thought had even finished forming, because some part of her had understood, even then, that whatever waited behind that wall had been waiting for someone to come looking, and she did not want to be the person who let it wait any longer. The Wilton descendant, listening nearby, added that his own grandfather had apparently said something similar once about the land itself. That ground remembered who had cared for it and who had not, whether or not the people walking over it ever bothered to ask. He said he had always assumed that was simply an old man's superstition. The kind farmers of a certain generation liked to repeat without meaning much by it, but standing in this particular room, he found himself less certain it had ever been superstition at all. Bryn stood at the top of the 12 steps as the light began to lean gold across the yard, watching the small crowd of strangers who were not really strangers anymore make their way back up into the afternoon, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the bank loan, already extended and already halfway repaid from a harvest that had finally drained properly once the old field tile was cleared, and nothing to do with Wade Pruitt, who had not called again since the courthouse steps, and, according to Louise, had quietly shifted his attention to a different valley entirely. It had everything to do, instead, with the simple fact that four families who had once built something together lost track of each other, and in one case turned bitter enough to nearly forget the reason they had ever worked side by side at all, had just stood together again in the same cool stone room their grandparents had shared without a single argument between them. That evening, after the last car pulled away down the gravel drive, Bryn walked out to the vault alone and carried down two wrapped wheels of cheese from the small dairy herd she had started keeping that summer, setting them carefully on the lower shelf beside the carved initials, the way she imagined someone had wanted exactly the same thing, in exactly the same spot more than 100 years before her. She checked the thermometer out of habit. 46 degrees, unchanged, patient, indifferent to lawsuits and offers, and the particular fears of an 18-year-old girl who had spent a season learning that some things were worth keeping, even when keeping them was harder than selling them would have been. She thought, standing there in the cool dark with the wheels of cheese settling into the same darkened patch of stone that had held cured meat and cloth wrapped rounds for centuries before hers, about the fencing pliers still sitting on her kitchen counter, and about Silas standing in this same yard 15 years earlier, refusing an offer he never explained to a single living soul. She understood now, in a way she could not have understood even a season earlier, that he had not been protecting a hole in the ground. He had been protecting a promise four families had made to each other before any of them were born, a promise that had somehow managed to survive a century of scattered farms, sold land, and one bitter argument over water rights, simply because enough people, in enough generations, had decided it was still worth keeping. She thought about Dale, too, standing in this same chamber only weeks earlier tracing his own family's initials with one finger, a man who had spent a decade believing his father capable of nothing but coldness, now standing instead in the one place that proved otherwise. She did not know if the two of them would ever be close in the ordinary sense people meant by family, but she understood they had at least arrived at something steadier than the anger that had first brought him to her porch. And that felt, on a quiet October evening, like more than she had any right to expect from a man she had known for less than 3 months. She climbed the 12 steps back into the evening air, closed the new timber door she had fitted to the entrance that same week, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the yard, looking back at the ground behind the barn that had once been nothing more than 40 years of things nobody wanted to deal with, and was now, again, exactly what four families had built it to be. The harvest came in 3 weeks later, lower fallow drier than it had been in years, once the old field tiles was finally cleared and repaired. The yield strong enough that the extended loan payment came due with room to spare, rather than the anxious math she had been doing at this same kitchen table only 2 months earlier. She paid it in full, on time, and sat afterward with Silas's old ledger open in front of her, adding a final line in her own handwriting beneath the last entry he had ever made in it, closing out a season that had started with a flooded field and ended with something considerably larger than a fixed drainage problem. She left the fencing pliers on the kitchen windowsill, next to Silas's reading glasses, no longer telling herself it was simply a good tool worth keeping. It was, she had come to understand, the same reason people carved their initials into stone where no one would find them for 100 years. Some things were kept not because they were useful, but because keeping them was itself the point. Then she went inside And for the first time since Silas died, she slept the whole night through without once waking to check the numbers on a bank statement that no longer frightened her the way it once had. She thought, drifting towards sleep that first easy night, of the 12 stone steps sitting quiet in the dark behind the barn, the cold air still moving through them the way it had moved, for longer than anyone could properly count for, patient, steady, and no longer waiting for anyone at all.